Well, good morning, church. Thank you for joining us on our deep dive. Today we're in Acts chapter 28, verses 1 to 6. This has been an action-packed part of the book of Acts. As you know, Paul is a prisoner on his way to Rome. There's been a shipwreck, and because Paul listens to God, those in charge listen to Paul, they all safely make it to shore. Now they're at Malta. They're cold, they're wet, and they're doing what you do when you're cold and wet. They're starting a fire. Paul is putting some wood in the fire, and there is a poisonous snake in that wood. The snake, avoiding the heat, comes out and strikes onto Paul. Paul shakes off the snake, and those natives, those around Malta, they recognized it was a poisonous snake. They knew the result. Paul would swell up and he would die. But they also make an assumption. They look at him and say, oh my goodness, he was a prisoner and there was a shipwreck and he barely survived the sea. So obviously he's suffering for the evil things that he has done. They were making that assumption because the worldview in that day was that. That's what Job's friends thought. Job was suffering because obviously he had done something displeasing to God. It's what the disciples thought happened when the man born blind. They knew he suffered because of sin. Was it his sin or his parents? Was their only question. And yet we know that is not true. We can fall into that worldview even though it's thousands of years later, somehow thinking that if all our ways please God, there is a bubble around our life. And if something bad happens to us, either we did something wrong or God is mad at us. And guess what? It's not true. We can suffer in our life when we do something dumb. It doesn't even have to be a sin. If we take all of our retirement funds and put it on a penny stock and it's gone, guess what? Dave Ramsey would call that stupid tax. And there is a price for that. Sometimes you can suffer and you've done nothing wrong. You're just in the proximity of someone who does something wrong or sinful. We see it in the Old Testament when in Joshua, the man takes the spoils and the nation, people die. They lose a battle. And then when they find out he's guilty, even his wife and his kids and his animals suffer for what he had done. They were in the proximity of someone who did something wrong. Sometimes we suffer in our life just because we live in a fallen world. And God has not protected us from the consequences of fallen world in which there is disease and there is nature actions and things that are happening. And then lastly, yes, sometimes we do go through trial, suffering, because God has chose it to put something in our life that will ultimately bring a greater glory to God and strengthen us. We see that in Paul's life when the thorn in the flesh is brought on Paul. And ultimately, Paul says, I will glorify God in my weakness because when I am weak, he is strong. But here's what we can know. When you're going through something, yes, first you should go to God and say, God, please remove this from me. We don't want to be like James where it says you have not because you ask not. We will say, God, remove it. But understand, when God moves into our time and when God does something like that, it's supernatural and it is a miracle. And by its very nature, it is rare. But it does happen. And we should seek after God to say, God, please answer this. But here's what we can know. That if God doesn't change the circumstance, he has the ability to give us the power and the perspective to go through it. That's what happened with Paul. When he was weak, he was promised, that Christ, my grace will be sufficient. He was promised supernatural power, and he was given a perspective that was different. When Paul was facing death in Philippians, and he didn't know if he was going to be freed or he was going to be executed, he had trust and power in God, but he also had perspective, knowing to leave this life was to be with God, and to him, that was a promotion. So listen, I don't know what stress you're facing in your life this week, but I want you to know God is there and he cares. And yes, you should go to God and say, God, please remove this from me. But if God doesn't understand that he will give you power and he will give you perspective that gives you the ability to go through it. Here's the catch. We want to know which of those four reasons these things are happening. And sometimes that's clear, but sometimes it isn't. But even if you can't understand it, you can still turn to God, receive his power, and receive his perspective to go through what you're facing. And ultimately, it will bring glory and honor to God. Guys, thank you for joining us in our deep dive. I hope you continue. We're so glad that you are on this journey with us.